new Pacific Mornings with Will on 531 PI.
It is 7:36. You're listening to Pacific Mornings on 531 PI. I'm William Turetti. It's great to have your company this Monday. Would love to hear from you. Pacific Mornings at pmn.co.nz or through our Facebook 531 PI. Now, according to a new report, several Oceania countries have seen sharp increases in sovereign debt due to disaster recovery efforts, particularly in response to natural disasters such as cyclones, earthquakes, and climate-related events. The countries including Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, Samoa, and Papua New Guinea are highly vulnerable to natural disasters, and their economic recoveries often depend on borrowing, leading to substantial increases in sovereign debt. Now, of course, international aid and concessional loans play a critical role, but the debt burden remains a long-term challenge. Joining me to discuss more on this is Tony Satoris from Caritas Oceania, New Zealand. A very good morning to you.
Kia ora, William. How are you?
Good. Thank you very much for your time this Monday. Hey, look, we'll crack straight into it. In terms of, we perhaps start with the high level in terms of the highlights of this report. Should we start there?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the big idea here is that there's this new thing happening, and it's not just in the Pacific, but it's particularly a big issue here, where climate change is creating sovereign debt in a way that perhaps it hasn't in the past. That's partly because climate change is getting worse. My organisation, Caritas Oceania, New Zealand, is working throughout the Pacific on climate issues right now. You know, it's not a one-day thing. It's an immediate issue for many countries. And, you know, in particular, that's landing in the form of cyclones and flooding that hasn't happened before. That's creating serious problems and particularly financial burdens for countries, which is just getting worse and worse. In the past, you know, we would think of development aid perhaps in terms of, you know, grey airplanes arriving and sacks of things being taken out and given to people. But increasingly nowadays, you're more likely to get an airplane full of bankers who are offering loans rather than actually, you know, giving grants. And that is having really quite serious effects in a number of Pacific countries where the debt is getting worse and worse and worse. And, you know, it could create a real debt spiral for the whole region.
Certainly. And look, I want to dig a bit deeper into the Pacific countries that perhaps are seeing this already. I mean, as highlighted, Fiji, Vanuatu, Tonga, Samoa, Papua New Guinea. Could we perhaps talk about those island nations and what we're seeing there?
Yeah, it's important to recognise that obviously every country is different, and the profile of what's happening and where the debt has come from, and the economies are significantly different between each of those. The report that we've written, Weathering the Storm, which people may be interested in reading, gives a great deal of detail about each country. But I mean, the big picture is that, to use Fiji as an example, one of the larger economies, certainly the biggest in that group. Fiji's got to the stage now where the debt is approaching 90% of GDP, which is a very high amount. What that means in practice is that around 15% of the total government spending every year is just paying the interest on the debt. And that's recognised internationally as a real danger threshold. Moving above that level means that governments end up having to stop, reduce their spending on basic services. And indeed, right now, Fiji is spending more on debt reservicing than they are on education or health. It's a big issue, and one that may well be getting steadily worse across the Pacific if change doesn't happen.
Certainly. And before we go there in terms of perhaps what's needed to fix or at least try and mend the issue, I mean, what's at risk here ultimately if we continue down this track?
I mean, the immediate risk is that governments like Fiji's, but other countries as well, get into a position where they're simply unable to continue with the social spending that is really required in the countries just simply because of the debt. Again, one change that's happened in the last decade or so is that most debt used to be owed to other countries, and so there was kind of always the possibility of a bit of friendly concessions being made. Nowadays, the majority of the debt's actually to the private sector, where that's much less likely. So the debts are solid and won't go away, and interest rates have spiked as well. So countries could get into a position where they're just simply unable to continue to operate whatever social safety net they currently have and whatever health services. It potentially is very serious, and it I suppose effectively adds up to countries losing the ability to become solidly able to help themselves, over time, losing resilience.
Wow. Okay. Look, let's go there now in terms of what do you think perhaps is needed to get on top of the issue? I mean, it does beg the question.
Look, I think the simple answer, I mean, these countries are not in a position where they have a lot of choice. When a lot of Fiji's debt arose through Cyclone Winston in 2016, they need help and they need change at the international level. There's quite a disturbing trend that we're seeing at COP, which is running right now in Azerbaijan, where what used to be climate grants from rich countries to developing countries are increasingly turning into climate loans. That's a really bad development in our view. There's a place for climate loans because countries sometimes need to invest in things that will create some return and allow them to repay the loans. But fundamentally, if a cyclone sweeps in and damages the country, you have to fix it. And also, it doesn't create profit to fix it. It just gets you back to where you started. So there needs to be an international change. And we think the New Zealand government has a really important role to play in this because this is an area of pride for New Zealand, actually. We are a country where all of our international giving related to climate is still in the form of grants rather than loans. So I think we have a sort of quite a moral authority on the world stage to talk about that. And we'd love to see that happen. There needs to be a change on the global stage.
I'm glad you brought up COP29 because I briefly just want to get your reaction to how you think it went in the context of, how it could help situations like in the Pacific. I characterize it, and perhaps it's a bit too harsh, it was a monumental disaster, at least from the host nation's perspective. We had their leader praising fossil fuels. I mean, it looked like read the room. It looked like a bad look. I mean, what did you make of COP29 though?
Well, I mean, it's the best we have, and I think it's something that it would be wise for the Pacific to lean towards. In 2 years' time, COP is coming to the Pacific, and we're already focused on really making sure that the Indigenous Pacific voice is loud and assertive when that happens. Because although there are lots of developing countries in the world that are experiencing climate impacts, the Pacific is particularly vulnerable because it's so low-lying and, there are really serious climate impacts already, as I said, that are leading already to existential concerns where islands and communities are having to move and just losing their land completely. It's really important that the stories of Oceania are leading the argument on the world stage. That's what we're working very hard to do. And I think it would be great for the Pacific to really lean into the fact that this isn't about being a sort of voiceless victim. It doesn't need to be that way. There's an opportunity for Pacific voices to actually lead the world because where the Pacific is now is where the whole world is going to be. So actually, the people of the Pacific are sort of the navigators, at the beginning, at the front of the Vaca. They're in a position to really help humanity steer away through all of this. They need to be heard, though, and they need to be valued. So that's what we're trying to do, and we really want to work with the Pacific to try to create that outcome.
For sure. And you mentioned New Zealand there should perhaps be leading, or leading the way when it comes to grants, etc. I want to get your opinion. Do you think there is appetite among other bigger nations like, say, China or the United States, not to get too political, but obviously Donald Trump's been re-elected and his climate change stance, well, is a bit iffy, to be fair. So do you think we'll see meaningful change from the likes of the US?
It's unclear, obviously, what's going to happen in the United States, but in the Pacific context specifically, the United States is a significant but not enormous player. So actually, I think what happens here is perhaps a bit separate from that. Pacific countries are experiencing huge strategic geopolitical change as they become this kind of, interest is arriving from all over many directions. I think it's important to be really wise during this time. I mean, for example, one of the risks that Pacific countries face is that they are tempted by this cash crunch of having to pay these big loans into unsustainable, mining, for example, or extractive industries, where they see a kind of a golden hope of being able to dig their way out, literally. It's really important that the longer term view stays in people's minds, and that there's I think that there's an assertiveness from the Pacific about what needs to happen in order to be able to survive and thrive, even in the face of this change. New Zealand, I think, is in a great position as a relatively wealthy country to influence the world's view of this subject, and in particular to get people thinking about the fact that climate damage leads to debt, and that has the potential to turn into a huge debt spiral that could be really damaging to the integrity and sovereignty of emerging nations. So, now's the time.
Certainly. Hey, thank you very much for your time this morning. Really appreciate it, and for the important work on the report too, which we will have up on our website, PMN News, as well, for you a wee bit later on with an article. You have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks again.
Kia ora, William. Thanks for your time.